Comes in the name of the Lord. Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. There is a general perception that science is in conflict with the biblical witness. This idea is misguided and based more on one's worldview rather than actual science. Most people believe science and faith are at war or in conflict. No group has perpetuated this idea of warfare more than a group of new atheists led by Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Sam Harris. The fact that emotion often accompanies religious belief is no reason to think religious belief is false. There's nothing intrinsically irrational about belief in God. While many scientists look on religion with skepticism, their objections don't ultimately undermine the rationality of Christianity. A new book has been published that underscores the idea that tension exists not because people of faith refuse science, but because atheist scientists have an entirely different worldview. This is underscored by comments like "science must destroy religion," made by Sam Harris. These suggest man created God as a name for what caused the inexplicable. They suggest science is skeptical inquiry into reality, while faith is dogmatic belief in the invisible. As faith is supplanted by science, one would think this worldview would lead to a more utopian world, but the opposite is true. War, homelessness, sex trafficking, violence, drug addiction, and abortion are all symptomatic of secularism, not faith based on respect and dignity of humans made in the image of a benevolent creator. One of the contributors says, "I've learned more about God through Scripture and more about His creation through science," says Dr. Andy Walsh, one of the contributors to this new work. Our next guest says Christians in science can encourage science literacy among believers. Indeed, she believes this is becoming imperative in a world that's growing increasingly hostile to religion. By engaging people of faith from biology, physics, engineering, theology, philosophy, and history, she shows that faith, not science, is the roadmap for giving hope and dignity, offering a better life and answering the questions on which atheists are mute. Hannah Eagleson is a writer, editor on staff with InterVarsity's Emerging Scholars Network. She edits Scholars Compass and Scholars Call, in addition to being the author of a growing number of ESN blog series, The Kingdom of God, Poems for Ordinary Time, Mentoring, Summer Quotation Series, What I Wish I'd Known About Graduate School. She's written for InterVarsity's Graduate and Faculty Ministries and The Well, Work in Progress, Finding the Shape of My Vocation. She holds a PhD in English Literature from the University of Delaware and a Master's of Arts from St. John. Joining us now to talk about her new book, which is a compilation of input from some great minds. The book is entitled Science and Faith, and our guest is the compiler and contributor, Hannah Eagleson. Hannah, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, this is such an important topic, especially for somebody that grew up in the 50s. Right? I grew up in a period of time when there was prayer in school, God in school. I came out of the synagogue where there was no question of creation. There was no question. This idea of Darwin was puzzling and confusing and kind of explained the odd behavior of certain relatives, but that was really its only application in our life, is that you could say, well, you know, Uncle Harry, he's probably one of the ones that Darwin was talking about that came out of the Galapagos Islands. And we would joke that way, but that would be the only conversation. But today this narrative has taken on a fierceness, almost a radical fierceness. And what's so puzzling to me is that science is a man-made construct. Science is not created by God. Science was created by man to begin to research and analyze and answer questions about the earth, about nature, about life, about cells. It's man-made. And so being man-made is fallible just by its own intrinsic design. So how do we argue this from a biblical worldview? We have to base our scientific premise, our hypothesis, that science is fatally flawed because it's created by a fatally flawed human being.
Well, I think, the idea that science is a human construct and it's not perfect is really important. But one of the things that I found most encouraging in editing this book is that a number of the authors dig a little bit into the history of science. And one really wonderful thing for believers about the history of science is there's a long history of Christians engaging productively in science and seeing science as a gift from God. And, like other gifts from God, like the family or human government, of course, it's going to be somewhat flawed in our current fallen world, but it can also produce just really wonderful, good gifts. And so getting a little glimpse into that history was very exciting. And also, a number of the authors write about how for them and many other scientists, they have this sense of awe when they use science to understand better how God created the world. And so I think that that's one of the really delightful things I took away from editing this volume.
It's interesting that you covered areas which I think are the most often under attack, and that is biology, physics, especially quantum physics, because quantum physics competes head-on with quantum faith. The whole thought that two things cannot occupy the same space at the same time is absolutely refuted by the presence of the Holy Spirit and my sin nature, both occupying the same space and at a constant battle that goes on with me. And neither one of them can be seen, but yet we know that they have an intrinsic impact and that they are a force. And when we take a look at science, science uses force as one of the equators in almost every formula having to do with physics. There has to be a force on something to affect something. And so if we take this view, we find that the understanding of physics only enhances faith and shows us the architect of time, the architect of space, the architect of an earth, of an atmosphere, of an outer space, and of another heaven, which we see explained so many times when we hear the words galaxies, other galaxies, astronomy. All of these things are talking about confirming in the beginning God created the heavens. And once we go to the plural, it's easy to say, well, certainly there's more than one heaven. It's the foundational statement of Genesis.
One thing that has really been interesting to me in the work I do in campus ministry, I talk to a lot of professors, many of them in the sciences, and I think that I couldn't prove this one with statistics. We'll have to wait till Pew Research looks it up or something and does a project on it. But I would say I frequently find that physicists are among the scientists who are very interested in a spiritual world because they're used to thinking about realities that there's some evidence for, but that we can't see and touch directly. And they're used to thinking in a way about those complex questions of reality. And, many other scientists are also approaching these questions of faith from their own disciplines in incredibly thoughtful ways. But it is really interesting to me how often you'll find that physicists are thinking a lot about questions of faith.
I think one of the key areas happens to be an area of expertise for me, and that is DNA. I wrote a book. It was a biblical thriller. It was about the weaponization of DNA, which is actually real. It is a very valid science in the genetics world. There is a non-DNA weaponization, non-proliferation agreement that's been signed by 40 nations, but there's also countries like Iran that did not sign it. And when the fall of the Iron Curtain took place, 200 of the greatest geneticists from Russia relocated to Tehran. And so we know that there is something to this. And so when you talk to geneticists and you talk to them about intelligent design and you talk to them about the XY chromosomes and the fundamental differences between men and women, science does not support society in this LGBTQ plus all this born a particular way. Science does not support many parts of this liberal thinking. So if a biblical worldview doesn't support it and science cannot justify it, then where does it put it except in the point of philosophy, if you will, which lives in neither of the science space or the faith space?
You know, we don't really address many questions of gender in the book just because we asked different groups to give us their questions. We wanted it to be based on what students were curious about. And it seemed like the most focus was kind of on other questions like, does the Bible support the scientific method in some way? And how can we engage questions about whether faith is rational well and things like that. And so the focus of the book is kind of a little bit elsewhere. I certainly do think that it's a really interesting question how worldview and science intertwine, and we have some authors who address that in some other ways by thinking about questions like how can you articulate how it's rational to be a believer and a scientist, and other questions along the lines of how do you talk well about faith with other scientists who may not themselves be believers? And I'm encouraged how often when you see these examples of really thoughtful Christians in science talking about their faith, how often secular colleagues are really open to listening to that. You kind of have to start by listening well to them and think about what matters to other people in my department and how can I talk about that in a way that engages with faith. But that's been one of the really encouraging things about this book, too, is just seeing all the great examples of really thoughtful, believing scientists who have wonderful ways of talking about both science and worldview and faith with their colleagues and building a good conversation there.
In the narrative of these contributors, in the beginning of the book, you talk about, or you have contributors, Joshua Ho, Greg Kutsana, Garrett League, and Clara Reyes-Tone, talking about the scientific method, the balance between faith and God, and understanding the natural world. How do you explain things just like that? All living things share 98% of the same DNA and RNA. There has to be some type of answer as to why all life is carbon-based. And so that becomes a building block. And so when we look at things that are living, they share a common base, a common pool of DNA and RNA that's assembled differently to give you a different product. So it's kind of like mixing paint, right? Everybody starts with white, and you take your can of white paint, right, to the counter, and they mix a third of this and a quarter of this, and finally it comes out and it's puce. And I don't even know what color puce is, but it shares the same RNA and DNA, 98% of it, as white paint, but it just has a couple of different ingredients. Well, we see that in nature. We see that a tree has much of the same RNA and DNA as a human being. There are certain foundational chemical construct which says if that's the case, we have a finite base of chemistry in order to look at creation. And we're not discovering new elements. We have the periodic table. I don't remember when it was last amended.
And I'll point you to the faith and science experts in the book on some of those questions. My own expertise is in communicating and putting together a coherent whole from their wonderful pieces. And so they'll be more qualified than I to address those very specific details. But I appreciate that you're interested in that level of detail. And I think we've got a great slate of experts in the book that I'm really proud to be able to feature.
And that's what's so encouraging to me, that you have assembled this. I don't think that I know of another compilation like this where you have the clear approach to questions that a lot of people have, but they don't have anybody to ask. I have a lot of books of why on my shelf. I've 2 volumes of the Jewish book of why. Why do Jewish people? I'm Jewish. Well, why do my people do this? Why do they say this? Okay, where did this originate? I have a lot of books on where did words or expressions, the origin of expressions, where did they come from? Are they a twist on something that's in the Bible? What's their point of origin? And I think that this compilation that you put together of science and faith and being able to examine it, and the contributors that you were able to assemble gives a great, for anybody that's interested in pursuing the answers to specific questions they have, they're going to find a lot of those answers contained within the book. The book's divided into really 4 distinct parts. What made you choose those parts, and how were you able to keep it very hard to get scientists to be consistent? They're very well disciplined in their discipline, but they're very undisciplined outside of their discipline. I think that's probably true of most of us, but in the scientific world, there's like the no-go zones within their particular areas of expertise. So how did you assemble this and set all this up?
Yeah, so it was really a fun and interesting process to put the book together. So we received a grant from a wonderful faith and science office at Fuller Seminary to work with young adults in our ministry, and especially with creating helpful resources for science and faith. And in that process, we talked to a really experienced InterVarsity campus ministry leader who leads huge teams of people who serve grad students and faculty. And he kind of said there are lots of great faith and science books out there, but there aren't that many that are really plug and play. Like, you can take the book off the shelf and you can read it together, and then you can have discussion questions. And even if you're, say you're a pastor or campus minister, you love and appreciate and respect science and scientists, but you're not a scientist yourself, sometimes it's just hard to figure out what you want to use in a small group. And so the goal of this was, let's pick questions that we know students and staffers are actually asking in our ministry, and then let's commission really smart, thoughtful people who are good science communicators to write an exploration of that question, and then provide some additional discussion questions that can really launch a great small group conversation. And so that was really a wonderful process. It was exciting to survey some groups we were working with within our ministry and figure out, okay, these seem to be the most pressing questions that the people in those groups have. And then we pulled together, we know so many wonderful science communicators who spend a lot of time thinking about how can I explain this well in a wider setting beyond my expertise, but also draw on my expertise. And so it was just really wonderful to draw on that great network that we have and feature their thoughts. And then we have a blog as well. So we published each piece at the blog. We had groups and individuals try them out and give us some feedback so we could help the authors make them even more clear and engaging, which they'd already done a great job on, but they were able to strengthen them even further. And then we published the book version. And in the book version, I kind of looked at all the questions and said, okay, what would be a useful way to break these down into categories, especially a way that would help small groups move through them and build a great discussion? And so we started with some kind of foundational questions like, is there material in the Bible that supports the idea of the scientific method? How is coming to know God similar to or different than coming to know the natural world that he's created through science, things like that. And those are great starting points because they lay some foundations. And then they also, those topics tend to not be too controversial. You might have slightly different takes on them, but they're a good place to just start a conversation and build rapport. And then we move on to things that kind of build on that across the course of the book.
In compiling this and being as intimately involved as you were with every word, with every question, with every answer, what was surprising to you? What did you come away with as an individual, as a believer, working with IVP, which I work very closely with? We have many of their authors on our program. The academic side of it, as well as the literary side of it. But I've always found that IVP has their foundation of authors are all deep thinkers.
Oh, yes. And so actually, this one is with Hendrickson Publishers, which is a little different. We did offer it to IVP first because they're our in-house publisher. We love to work with them. It wasn't quite in the niche they were working on at the time, so they gave us their blessing. But we're eager to work with IVP down the road and other things and collaborate with them closely. And we've also had a great time working on this one with Hendrickson's. It's been wonderful all around. But I think it's just wonderful to work with all these thoughtful authors, as you say. And I think a couple of takeaways I had that were really fun and encouraging were, one, I know all the folks that we invited to write are great communicators, but I think they even exceeded my expectations in their ability to come up with thoughtful metaphors and good stories from their own experience. And so that was very exciting. One quick example I'll share is that Dr. Robert Caída is an award-winning physicist who spent most of his career at Princeton University, and he's a very thoughtful supporter of faith and science conversations as well. And he tells, I think, a really delightful story in the book about how one year he taught VBS for his church, which was near Rutgers University in New Jersey, a large research university there. And he and the church were able to collaborate to invite some students from maybe lower income neighborhoods in the area to come to the VBS and invite them into the community and learn from them and work with them. And he designed a curriculum for them kind of based around the idea that God is creative and he wants us to be creative. And he encouraged them from Genesis on that topic each morning, and then led field trips on the Rutgers campus to the art museum and to science labs where some Christian colleagues were working. And it was just a moment when he was really able to use his science expertise and his faith and commitment to his local church in a way that really supported great conversations. And some of those students kind of came out of that experience saying, I'm not sure I've ever wanted to go to college before, but now I think I really might. How can I prepare for it? And so think that's a great example of maybe a slightly unexpected way that Bob used his knowledge and skills in both science and faith to support his community.
Well, anytime you can get a scientist to talk and to give you the tools how to talk to secular colleagues, to talk to people who don't share, and it's not a rebuttal, it's not an argument, it's not confrontational, but it's kind of not even question and answer, it's question and question. Right? This is actually rabbinically how we teach. It's answering questions with questions, which make it probative. If you read the parables, you'll find that many of the parables and many of the ways that we teach in the Jewish world, I'm a Jewish believer, but in the Jewish world is parables. The answer is in the middle of the parable, and we give you the answer, but because we're so used to waiting to the end, thinking that we have to look at the clues at the end, we tend to ignore the center. It's kind of like the Oreo. For me, the outer part of the Oreo has no attraction whatsoever. I'm the middle of the Oreo kind of guy. There's some people that say if you don't do it all together, or if you don't double them up, there's all different ways of eating an Oreo. But for me, it's the middle because I was taught that way. I was taught to look and examine in the middle. So it kind of comes through. But having those kind of tools, finding out how someone actually did interact with their secular colleagues and provided a way for them to be open to the narrative, not shutting it down. And I think too often we are pretty legalistic. We're so convicted that we want to refute as opposed to using kind of the art of self-defense, using that oncoming energy. Just step out of the way and let it kind of dissipate before you engage, because we are under a certain amount of persecution. We are the minority position in the world. If you take a look at Christianity, 2.5 billion compared to a worldwide population of almost 8 billion, we are a minority. We're only 30%. I mean, 70% don't believe what we believe. We tend to take a more North American view just because we're proud Americans. But the truth is, the world is not representative of the United States, and the United States is not necessarily representative of the world. But in the scientific community, that is one area where the world is much more engaged in a unified scientific approach. We have more scientists coming out of the Middle East. We have more scientists coming out of Europe, of Asia, of Africa. It's much broader than we have in the faith community, which is very different. And so it's kind of interesting to see the different points of view and why people hold on to the belief that science and faith cannot coexist, but that they are independent of each other, where most of the new science that's coming out, at least in the journals that I get, are exposing that science is confirming parts of the Bible. And there's new digs and new archaeological finds which confirm passages of Scripture, which is kind of if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. So if the prophecies are true, and we can confirm and verify 80, 90% of what the Bible says, does that mean that faith in something which has been proven using an exploratory archaeological method would line up with the science? And so there's a great deal of argument for, and then there's those diehards that they won't change just because they have that contrarian spirit, which says that I don't care what you say. If I give up on this, then I'm putting science at one step lower than faith, and I'm a scientist. I'm not a theologian. And they think that you have to be one or the other. And that is a battle that we face in the field that we're in. We're talking with Hannah Eagleson, who has compiled just a delightful compilation of contributions answering about science and faith. And can they coexist? Are they mutually exclusive? Or is there a way that the questions that have been pressing on your mind and your heart can be answered by a number of fascinating contributors? I think 16 different contributors have been put together to come up with some of these answers. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to take a look at these 4 sections. The getting started, building good conversation among scientists about faith, building good conversation among Christians about origins, and the 4th section exploring further within science and Christian communities about how to go deeper. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back with Hannah Eagleson after these short announcements. The Lord meets you right where you are, and so does Igniting a Nation's new live streaming outlets. You can now watch Revealing the Truth, Revealing the Bible, and Prophecy Revealed simulcast live each Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 1 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time on YouTube Live, Facebook Live, Vimeo, Periscope, and through our website, www.ignitinganation.com. No matter what device you are using, our program will automatically scale so you won't have to miss a single program. And if you happen to miss an episode, you can always subscribe to the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel and access over 1,000 interviews and never miss your favorite authors, special guests, and topics that interest you the most.
There are lots of ways to see Israel, but nothing compares to seeing the land of the book and the people of the book through the eyes of 2 Jewish believers who can take you on a journey that will bring the entire Bible to life. When you join Rabbi Eric Walker and his #1 rated tour guide, Edo Canaan, in Israel, you'll experience incredible teachings, first-class accommodations, and actually walk where Jesus walked. You will experience the Bible transforming from black and white into living color, and you will never see the Bible in the same way again. For more information, visit us at www.ignitinganation.com/events.
The Lord contends with what contends with you, and Igniting a Nation is committed to bringing to light each and every issue that faces a believer's life. Our live stream programming and teachings take you on a journey to finding biblical truth from a wide variety of experts who share their insights into a deeper walk with the Lord. We have assembled the most comprehensive panel of experts in the fields of prophecy, caregiving, healing from trauma, shame, and abuse, and so much more. We continue to expand our teachings and programming to meet your needs. We're committed to healing the nations with biblical truth. Visit www.ignitinganation.com to develop a deeper walk with the Lord and start your journey to a transformed life. The Bible commands us to study to show ourselves approved, but most study using Bible study tools and not actually studying the Bible chapter and verse. Igniting a Nation is pleased to present Revealing the Bible, recorded and taught each week before a live audience. We take you deeper into the actual Bible and verse in both Hebrew and English and connect the dots between the Old and New Testament. You can attend our 2 classes in Tuscaloosa and Birmingham, or watch the program every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Central Time on ignitinganation.com and all our other simulcast outlets. For more information, visit www.ignitinganation.com/events. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Hannah Eagleson, who is the compiler, the editor of a great new book called Science and Faith, which is a compilation of contributors of the PhD scientist level who are answering questions about faith and science. Hannah, welcome back to the program.
Glad to be here.
Hannah, as you interacted with each one of these, first of all, how did you select the group? Did somebody give you a recommendation, or was that part of the research that you did in finding those who were willing to participate in the program?
Well, this is the wonderful thing about having a large network like the InterVarsity Campus Ministry Network and other like-minded Christian organizations that serve faculty and grad students and undergrad students on campus. So we had several different ways of finding authors. Some of them were ones I already knew because perhaps they'd already written for our national blog, or I had attended a local graduate or faculty group with them at some point. Others I kind of asked around in our networks and said, who do you know who could write really well about this topic? And people were very supportive on helping me find them. And then also, one other really wonderful thing that came out of it is we had these small groups of university grad students and leaders testing out the material. And at least two people from those groups were themselves talented science communicators that we were able to commission to write some of the pieces of the book. So it was a really fun process of seeing a whole community come together.
I think one of the most fascinating parts of the book was the way you charted the early Christianity to medieval Christianity to modern Christianity, and the migration of information, the merger of technology, and how technology played a role in illuminating some things that are for some making them almost forcing them to say there is no other explanation. I can only hold on to my atheism for so long because the science is telling me something completely different. And I think there's some wonderful things to come, chapters yet to be written because of the advances we're making in technology that are revealing. Carbon dating used to be the ultimate, the end-all and be-all to all science, was that's how we explained the dinosaurs, and we explained everything was through carbon dating, which is in some ways a fatally flawed science because we can simulate in a laboratory the advanced aging of something that I could then take to the carbon dating lab next door, and they would tell me that what I just brought them was 14.5 million years old, and I could have just made it in my laboratory yesterday. There's new things that are happening that are so exciting and so revolutionary that it's really quite extraordinary that this is going on, and that you've included kind of the migration in here in the book. For you personally, what was the one or two areas that were revelatory to you that helped you either settle into and reinforce your conviction, or questions that you had but you had not found an answer to? It didn't shake your faith, but it was something that was not as firm as you would have liked it to have been, but when you came away from the compilation, that it was firmed up for you in a much more profound way.
Well, I'm so glad you pointed to those closing articles in the book by Dr. James Ungarinu, who is a historian of science. I found those very compelling myself, and I've found I love history anyway. I have a PhD in Renaissance literature, so history is a good companion to that. And I knew a little bit about this history of Christians being engaged in science from kind of really the early days of what we now know as the scientific method being developed, kind of around the 17th century. But it was so good to have James's really wide-ranging expertise as a historian of science, and it was really encouraging to look at the way that he surveys all of these ways that Christians have always been thinking well about the natural world, and even helped to craft some of the early ideas about the scientific method with people like Robert Boyle, who are very faithful believers. And, James is very nuanced and honest, and he also addresses some moments where maybe faith and science conversation didn't go as well as it should have. And I'm grateful for that. But I think on the whole, it's just a very encouraging survey of how well Christianity and science can interact, and also some ways that we can improve that even more in the future. So that was very encouraging to me and a lot of fun. And I've also found, as I've talked with scientists about the book, that they too find history very encouraging. And it's great for them to look at figures like Boyle and say, oh, here's a great model of someone who was very faithful to God and very good at science.
There's a new book out called The New Copernicans. It is a book about millennials, written by John Seal, that identifies the millennials as the new Copernicans, that they're searching for relevance in faith, not just faith for the sake of faith, that looking for where faith is relevant. And as we look at the construct of the church, we often confuse the church with faith. We often confuse religion with faith. And one of the things that this book does is it clearly is divorced from religion. It is steeped in faith in God, or in looking at God and faith in God and relative to science, as opposed to the doctrines of religions, which are there's 38,000 denominations of Christianity. So when you parse something that many times and you slice it that many, there's not much of the pie to go around. If you were to make this a religious work, you would have to then embrace all the tenets of all the religious practices or views of Christianity. So what I see very clearly is the issue is between faith and science, not between religion and science. And I think that's an important distinction to make.
I love how you bring up relevance as an issue. It was one of the questions that the groups we worked with raised. They said, what about, how do you talk with people who don't see faith and science as hostile necessarily? They just wonder if faith is irrelevant to the whole endeavor. And our regular science columnist at the blog, Andy Walsh, I think does a really nice job of exploring some ways that you can show how faith is relevant in your own life as a scientist or in other ways. And I do really appreciate how all of the authors, they're very well grounded in their faith, and many of them are theologians or very theologically informed scientists, so they know a lot of specifics of theology, but I think they've done a really good job here of picking the most illuminating specifics and then also giving a broader picture of, let's think about the really big scale questions of how faith and science engage, and then obviously people can go on from there to more specific details, but it is one thing I'm really delighted about in the final book and how it turned out. And I think one other thing that's just really stood out to me in the process of compiling it is this sense of wonder and creativity that is also something many people are looking for these days, I think, and rightly so. And I feel like a number of these scientists have done a great job of pointing to how, for them, science is a creative endeavor, and it builds this sense of wonder. And that's often a great starting point as well. For me, it's very satisfying because even though my field is very, very different in Renaissance literature, it's also motivated by that sense of creativity and wonder. So it's a nice connection point with our writers. And then also, it's just a great starting point on conversations about science and faith because Elaine Howard Eklund, who's a really thoughtful sociologist of science, a professor at Rice University, has done a lot of research and found that many scientists, wherever they land on a faith spectrum, even often atheist scientists, say that one of the big motivators for them in science is this sense of wonder. So it's a shared place to start, and then we can talk further about where does that wonder come from. For the people in our book, often it's this explicit sense that God has created this, but it's a great conversation starter, I think.
Well, one of the things that in the book, and you mentioned Andy Walsh, he says God is less of a watchmaker who wound once and wandered away, and more of a gardener who's constantly cultivating. And when you take a look at that and say, okay, this wasn't a one and done kind of creation, I gave it a week, that's all it needed, and I'm done. That there's this refining process, there's this growing process, there's this cultivating process, and this is why it's part of a journey. And it's also the same journey that science is on, looking for an answer. We are searching for answers. If you're in the faith world, you're looking at problems that people have to wrestle with. Why is there, if this is a loving God, why is there disease? Why is there war? Why is there famine? Why is there death? Why is, and how can you put stock in something you cannot see? Well, I can't see hydrogen. I can't see oxygen. I can't see many of these things that you built your science on. So let's both agree that we believe in things we can't see. And once you get to that common ground, I can't see oxygen. Sorry. I can't see love. Do you love your wife? Well, yeah. Well, you can't see that. That's an emotion. You love your children. Yes. Okay. So there's things that are intangible that you have a belief in. That why then is it any more radical an idea to believe in an entity are you saying that love doesn't heal? If you come home and you have an expression of love, does it not heal a wound that somebody has in a relationship? Well, yes, it does. Well, you've just healed something you cannot see with something that you cannot see, and yet you have a result that can be seen. Well, that's a pretty preposterous concept, but yet it's very real.
When I'm working in faith and science conversations, I often think of that verse in Hebrews about faith being the evidence of things hoped for and those things not seen. And, I think it's a really powerful scriptural statement that also encapsulates some of the ideas I think about in these faith science conversations. And I know another scientist in the University Network, Dr. Cullen Bowie, has written and spoken very thoughtfully about how science requires a certain amount of faith. You have to believe that you can get somewhere, and you can get maybe not all the answers, but at least an answer that's going to improve the state of knowledge and improve the world. And, a couple of our authors also, as they're talking about the history of science, sort of talk about how in many ways Christianity is a worldview that's very, very compatible with science, because the 17th century theologians who are writing around the same time that modern science is developing have this sense that the world is relatively stable. Sometimes things are unexplained, but generally speaking, you can get up and expect that the sun is going to rise each morning. You can expect that certain things happen every time for the most part, and that's very compatible with a belief in a stable God who gave us a world that he designed to be good for us. And so that's also been an encouraging thing to think about as I've worked on the book.
What question kind of comes to my mind is that have we, because of our behavior as believers, which is not always exemplary, which is not always praiseworthy, have we contributed to some of the negative reception to a foundation of faith because of our human condition and our human frailties and what has befallen of the Catholic Church and what's befallen the Baptist Church, and things that have not reflected well on a faith-based system, which does not yield any tangible, quantifiable different result in divorce rates or in murder rates or in suicide rates or in things which are statistically studied. We don't see a radical difference in the measurable areas which scientists are looking for, the quantifiable. And if we knew that there were people out there that were paying attention, if we actually stopped long enough to realize people are watching, people are looking, people are making decisions about faith based on statistics, based on how we rank. Okay? If we have the same amount of divorces as non-believers, what's the advantage to being a believer? If we have the same amount of murders as non-believers, what's the advantage to being a believer? So when we take a look at it, we break it down to human nature, there is a conflict between faith and science because we cannot scientifically prove that those who have a construct of faith are better people.
One of the harder and more important things you need to do in campus ministry and in any ministry really is to admit the moments when our fallen humanness gets in the way of what God intended and to be repentant about that. And so I think that is a really important point to make and to recognize. But I think what's also great is that God is forgiving and He redeems. And so we have the opportunity when we admit those things to kind of move on and say, how can we craft the best possible conversation here? How can we listen better to our friends and colleagues? How can we figure out places where maybe as believers we've sometimes gotten it wrong and do a better job? And so I think that's also been one of the things that I found really exciting about crafting this book, is to talk to so many really thoughtful believers who are great at listening to what other people are interested in science, and great at recognizing when we've made mistakes, and great at advancing the conversation and building towards a stronger future conversation. And so that's, I think, a really encouraging thing that I've seen in the whole process.
Well, the beauty is that if we can create a narrative where we can find out what objection needs to be overcome, then we have a narrative that can move towards a successful conclusion. And if we have no objections and we have nothing to overcome, we're operating in a vacuum. So we have to have these narratives, we have to have these discussions, we have to have these points of contention in order to find some kind of resolution, hoping that they will come to, when we talk about fallen nature, when we talk about forgiving God, when we talk about an entity where there is redemption, that when you blow up your lab because you mixed the wrong chemicals, right, wouldn't it be nice if the university didn't fire you? Right? Well, that's the God we serve, as opposed to the chancellor of the place that you worked for. There's the difference. So it's quite a great study, and I thoroughly enjoyed doing the research to put this together and to be able to talk with you about it. You've done a wonderful job, and I'm glad that they chose somebody who has such a strong literary background to be able to assemble this in a way that makes sense to those that are not PhDs in physics and in these particular disciplines. But the book is called Science and Faith. You can look it up under author Hannah Eagleson, Eagleson. And Hannah, you have been a delight to have on the program. We wish you great success with the project.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here, and I
God
appreciate
bless you.
your taking the time.
Thank you. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.